Welcome to a special episode of Real Bigfoot Encounters with Reverend Jeff. This week's story comes from the depths of my very own encounter records, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. I was invited by my friend Jack to go camping off-grid deep in the Ocala National Forest. It was Halloween weekend and the moon was going to be full, so we figured the night fishing would be unbeatable. I took the time off from my IT job and headed up to meet Jack at his place to pack up and head out early. We drove up the middle of the forest on Route 19 for what seemed like forever. We hadn't passed a car or seen a home in well over 15 miles. Jack had found a little place called Grasshopper Lake, and it was just the type of place he liked to take the Jeep to get away from it all. We headed off the main road and down onto this very small trail that led deeper off-road and up around the swamp area of the lake. Jack spotted a safe place to pull the Jeep up on dry land, and it was perfect to make camp, not 20 yards from the water. We quickly dropped the sleeping gear and set up a small camp with a fire pit surrounded by our hammocks, gathered up a bunch of firewood as we wouldn't want to try to do that after dark, and this was the first we heard. A high-pitched whoop came across the lake. Jack and I had been camping for years off-grid in places just like this, and he never heard a sound like that. We wrote it off as some weird animal and went back about our business. I must admit we weren't being very stealthy, kidding and joking and being young men, and we had stirred things up quite a bit. Well, the camp was set up and the wood was split and stacked. It was time to get a line wet and catch us some dinner. Hours had passed with a few small panfish in the bucket when all of a sudden, what seemed like right beside us, we heard a loud knock like a baseball bat on a log or something of the sort. Jack sprung up from his seat, thinking maybe that the tree had given way and it could be falling on us. I set down my rod and looked around. We could find nothing that led us to that sound. Just about then, my rod drag went off and something big was on the line, so I snagged up my rod and set the hook and started to fight the fish, when again from across the lake we heard knocks, but this time it was 3 of them. Knock, knock, knock. Methodical almost. It seemed intentional, yet we couldn't see much past 5 feet into the bank as the woods were very dense there. I managed to reel in a really nice catfish, so we gathered up our things and walked back to camp to clean the fish and start a fire. I grabbed up the fire tinder bundle and made Jack clean the fish. Since I obviously caught the biggest meal, he got to clean it, as our bet always went. He was a pro, cleaned the fish in a bucket as to not attract the local wildlife, and took the leftovers back down to the lake and washed out the bucket. While Jack was out of camp, right from behind me, I heard what sounded like a snort. As there are hundreds of wild bear in the area we were, I stopped what I was doing and started to check my surroundings for danger. I noticed something moving about 25 yards back in the scrubs, but soon it was gone. Jack had returned, and I told him what happened. He mentioned he had heard a snort down by the lake as well. Whatever they were, there was more than one of them. A few hours passed, and the sun had set and gone. The full moon was on the rise when Jack decides to try and replicate the knocks we heard early in the day. He picked up a large branch and wailed it against a thick pine tree, breaking the branch into a few pieces and letting out a loud cracking knock, and that's when the trouble began. Right away, something just outside the firelight started pacing back and forth between the trees. Jack backed up next to me in camp and quietly asked if I had seen it, which I did. It was tall, very tall, dark and moving on 2 legs. Then just as fast, we lost sight of it. Then from behind us, a fist-sized rock hit the log right next to the fire. I picked it up and tossed it back to the location from where it came. 40 seconds later, it came back into us again from a different side of camp. Now Jack looked at me and I stared right back at him, and I'm sure we had the same thought, just what in the hell do we do now? We took notice of any direction we could flee, as it seemed to be the 2 animals were stalking in closer to camp. I started to build a fire higher, piling lots of small branches on it to make it as bright as possible, and that's when we saw it. 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, one arm wrapped around a giant pine tree, and the other hanging at its side nearly to its knee, peeking out from the tree not 10 yards from the fire. It hissed, and then let out a loud whoop, and it darted from the darkness. Just then, a couple of pine cones were tossed into camp. We turned to look at where the pine cones came from, then back to where the Bigfoot had been standing, and it was gone. Jack and I sat close to the fire the rest of the night. We kept it burning bright until the sun had risen enough to see the lake. We dashed down to the lake and brought back a bucket of water and killed the fire, then packed up camp. We jumped into the Jeep and tore off backwards, the highway that led us back to town. We stopped at the ranger station that was on the edge of town, and the poor lady ranger on duty just couldn't really grasp what we were trying to tell her. She said we had to have been mistaken for bears, but bears don't walk on two legs, and Florida black bears are not 8 foot tall. Jack and I did far less camping after that trip. We decided to keep our encounter between us until we found somebody we could trust. I guess that's why I'm telling you now. They're out there. I've seen them. And if you get lucky, you will too. These avid fishermen tempted fate and angered the Bigfoot. Some things that go bump in the night are better left alone. It could have been far worse, but indeed it was another real Bigfoot encounter. Thanks for watching. I'm Reverend Jeff, and may the Squatch be with you.